So I thought I
I,
would.
I I did it, Emily. Sorry,
Oh,
I
okay.
jumped the gun.
No problem. Thank you so much. Um, Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. My name is Emily Cutright, and I am a program strategist on our Veterans for American Ideals team at Human Rights First. And I'm here today to provide a welcome and an overview before we get started. Today, VFAI is going to sit down with Fred Wellman to discuss how and why veterans are crucial in defending our democracy and building a brighter future for the country that we love. I am delighted to introduce our panel of three today, but before I do that, I'll give a quick introduction to VFAI for those of you who might not be familiar with our work. VFAI, Veterans for American Ideals, is a coalition of thousands of veterans and allies across the country who continue their service to the United States by upholding, defending, and advocating for human rights at home and abroad. Our mission is to uphold the American ideals that we fought for, which include equality and freedom and fairness, just to name a few. What this looks like in practice is advocating for our wartime allies who assisted our troops in times of war and conflict, particularly Afghans and Iraqis over the last 20 years. It also looks like restoring access to asylum at our US southern border and confronting domestic political extremism. More specifically, the American ideals that VFAI stands for includes civil rights and democracy. We safeguard human rights by promoting and strengthening our democratic values, institutions, and practices. We believe that democratic extremism and anti-democratic forces are the biggest existential threats to the United States, which is something that our panel will tap into later. Another American ideal is welcoming communities. We build communities where people feel fleeing persecution can find refuge and belonging and welcome them with open arms. And lastly, an American ideal that we stand for is active citizenship. We encourage veterans and all citizens, no matter their political preference, to engage in civic life and participate in the democratic process. And so we believe that when America's policies and actions no longer match its values, when hate and extremism are normalized, and when our democratic processes are threatened, our global legitimacy is undermined. And over the years, VFAI has been instrumental in strengthening democracy within the United States. But as we've seen over the past few years, this democracy is at risk, which brings us to our conversation today. And so I'm honored to introduce Pete Lucier, Chris Purdy, and Fred Wellman speaking to these threats. And so I'll do some brief introductions. So first we have our moderator, Pete. Pete served as an infantry rifleman from 2008 to 2013, where he deployed to Cuba, Spain, Bahrain, and Afghanistan. After the Marine Corps, Pete worked as an oil rig roughneck and a private security guard, all while completing his undergraduate degree, which he received from Montana State University. Pete serves as on the Veterans Advisory Council for Everytown for Gun Safety, and since 2021 in August, he has worked with organizations seeking to assist in the safe relocation of at-risk Afghans. And on a personal note, I had the honor of seeing Pete speak in front of the House Foreign Affairs Committee this time last year on how our government needs to step up and keep the promise that our military made to our wartime allies. And Pete, you were a powerhouse. Next, we have Chris Purdy, who is the Director of Veterans for American Ideals and Outreach at Human Rights First. He first worked at VFAI as a volunteer, then as a fellow, and finally joined our staff in 2016. Prior to working with VFAI, Chris developed school reform programs and policy in the Atlantic public schools. And Chris, for 8 years, served in the Army National Guard, deploying to Iraq and Thailand. And finally, we are joined by Fred Wellman. Fred is an American political consultant, an Army combat veteran, and a media personality. He advises political candidates, nonprofits, and political action committees engaged in pro-democracy efforts, as well as managing his own podcast, newsletter, and appearing on national media. He currently hosts On Democracy with F.P. Wellman, and he was the executive director and a senior advisor to the Lincoln Project during the 2020 general election campaign and after. He was the founder and CEO of his own public relations and advocacy firm, which focused on veterans for a decade after his retirement from the US Army. He served for over 22 years as an Army aviator and public affairs officer, including 4 combat tours in Operation Desert Storm in Iraq. And he is a graduate of the United States Military Academy at West Point, as well as Harvard Kennedy School. And currently he lives in St. Louis, his hometown, which is where Pete lives as well. So we have a great Midwest contingency here.
Midwest represent.
Yeah, exactly. Before we get started, just a reminder to please utilize the question and answer box at the bottom of your screen throughout this conversation. And if there's time at the end, we'll take a few questions from the audience. But Pete, over to you.
Hey, thanks so much, Emily. And thanks so much again to our guests for being here today. And for everybody who's joined us in the audience. I see some names I recognize. So thanks everybody for taking some time out of your day. This is an election year. It's important to talk about democracy, and veterans play an important role in it. So it's an important conversation. It's going to be ongoing. Thanks for joining us. First question as part of our conversation goes to Fred. So Fred, you have a podcast called On Democracy. You've been involved in this kind of work for a long time. You've worked campaigns. If you could tell us a little bit, how did you get started in democracy work, and what is democracy work? When we talk about, democracy activism, what does that look like? You're obviously involved in it, in all kinds of ways. So tell us a little bit about that.
Sounds kind of cheesy, like a made up title. I think it is actually. It's like one of those people. Like, I updated my LinkedIn and just decided that was a good. Well, it's a classic story of stumbling into something, right? I mean, I was, as you know, I served 17 years old. I went to West Point, did 22 years plus after I graduated. Started my own PR firm focused on veterans advocacy, and that's what I did. That's where I met you fine gentlemen. Was really working at that, of helping pass IVF for veterans, things like that. And then, of course, it was a great big pandemic, if you guys recall. And, I started having thoughts of frustrations with both our democracy when Trump came down the golden escalator. And I've told the story often of, I knew we were in trouble as a nation, to be honest with you guys, when Trump said that he didn't think John McCain was a hero because he was captured, that he likes people that weren't captured. And in my mind, back in 2015, I was like, that's it. He's done. I do veterans advocacy. Our community is going to turn on him. And what shocked and dismayed me was it didn't. That so many people accepted that and made the excuse, well, McCain's a traitor, and I was shocked. And that's when I was dismayed, when that fall, and I'll talk about this all because they don't exist anymore, when the folks who ran Rolling Thunder, which if those of us in the industry, in the community may know, Rolling Thunder is dedicated to POWs and MIAs of Vietnam. It was founded by Vietnam veterans. They roll 1,000, hundreds of thousands, if not, motorcycles through DC on Memorial Day. It's honored POWs and MIAs. And 5 months after Trump said that, they made him the guest speaker. And I was like, oh shit. We are in trouble. And so I kind of started looking at this then. So after I closed my firm during the pandemic, I called out to a friend of mine, a mentor named Steve Schmidt, whom I'd met in Iraq when I was working for Petraeus, and he was working for the vice president. And he said, hey, come work for us, come to the Lincoln Project. You're going to run our veterans pillar. And we realized at the Lincoln Project at the time that we were going to have to peel off a few of the Republican voters that voted for Trump to make sure he wasn't reelected. And so that's how I fell into politics. I remember I said to Steve, I said, I've never worked in politics. He goes, bro, you work for 3- and 4-star generals. You've been doing politics for 2 decades. I'm like, oh yeah, it's a good point, And so, we decided and so we had 4 main pillars at Lincoln. It was women, it was Latino, it was evangelicals, and then veterans and military families. And I ran the veteran military family pillar. And the idea being just convince folks from our community to say, hey, look, you don't have to be a Democrat. You don't have to be, and going back to your initial question, we just have to recognize that Trump and Trumpism and what he's done to our nation, he should not be the commander in chief. That the things he's done, like issuing orders in the military via tweet. If you guys remember, the transgender ban was done by tweets. That there were stories coming out that the military literally had, DOD had people monitoring Trump's Twitter to monitor that for orders. No matter the national security system. We found out after he left office that he had McAtee just drop a memo saying we're leaving Afghanistan, and was going to try. And the only thing that stopped him was DOD said, what the F is this? You can't just write a memo and leave a country. That's not how it works. They literally copy and pasted a different, a national security order that was in a drawer. So That's what we did. And that's how I fell into pro-democracy. For me, pro-democracy work means, and obviously I'm partisan, I admit that freely. For those who maybe don't disagree with my politics, that's fine. But it is in recognition that there are unique threats to our democracy at this moment. And they come from not just MAGA, not just that far right, but the media has a role to play where they're acting as neutral observers, even as our rights are being stripped away. The bureaucracy has a role to play. Even DOD, which is still painfully unaware of politics, which leads to things like the chairman of the Joint Chiefs walking across Lafayette Square in uniform with the president for a political stunt because he just didn't recognize before he stepped out that it was going to be a political thing. So, long answer to a short question. I stumbled into this, as many of us do, and I've taken it upon myself to try and use this voice. And through my work, I've been blessed to have a large platform for reasons I can't explain. People want to hear my crazy shit. So at the ripe age of 56 or so, I decided to be the ultimate cliche, a middle-aged white guy with a podcast. And my day job, honestly, though, I'm a political consultant. I help candidates run for office.
Yeah. No. Well, and first of all, I'm glad you did. It's one middle-aged white guy with a podcast that I'm glad exists. And
Well, I
and we
appreciate
know
that.
each other personally, but no, I'm glad you're doing the work that you're doing. Switching to Chris for a second, some of the things I heard Fred say is that this felt different. This didn't feel just like partisan differences, right? Like some of the things that were kind of coming into being in some of the political movements, especially around 2016, felt different, felt more threatening to kind of the core of who we are. So Chris, and to our democracy, for Chris, you started as a volunteer before taking over, and now you're the director and program manager for VFAI. Did these attacks did it feel different? Did it feel more partisan? Is that how you got involved in this? How can you talk to us about your own kind of journey, and what did some of those threats look like? What was different about kind of a MAGA movement and a Trump movement and other threats to democracy that you were seeing maybe around that same time?
Yeah, I think I think Fred and I have similar pivot points, right? Like 2016, I couldn't name it. I was in education at the time, and I just knew something was wrong. I could see the winds blowing, and it just felt wrong. And then in 2020, really, I'm in VFAI, where are working on refugee issues and SIV issues, and 2020 was about two things for me. Broadly, it was about democracy, right? Like the democratic process. And what we saw in 2020 was attacks on free speech protesters advocating for civil rights, right? You had the Black Lives Matter movement that was born out of some horrific tragedies. And the way that the Trump administration at the time really tried to use the military, use the apparatus of the Department of Defense to quash free speech was shocking to us. And so, we wanted to kind of push back against that. And also in 2020, COVID was happened. I don't know if you guys remember the pandemic. There was a the massive gap in poll worker recruitment. So there was a fear, I think, and certainly I had this fear that if there weren't enough poll workers, we would see the democratic process, become politicized. We could see potentially the military become politicized in the democratic process. And so that's when we created this program to maybe get to get veterans out as poll workers. Thankfully, we've had some really great partners, and we, the veterans and Vet the Vote, who've taken that off to do some great work and are continuing to do it. But really, 2020 was the moment that we'd gone through 4 years of Trump, and we could see the winds were blowing even further. And if we didn't do something, if the veteran community didn't get up and say, hey, we believe in the democratic process, not to say that we pick a candidate, we are nonpartisan 501c3, but what we know is that there are candidates who get into power and then they use that power to dismantle democracy. And that was really a concerning trend that we saw that summer of 2020.
Yeah. One of the things I'm kind of hearing both of you guys saying, I think the word democracy and what we're talking about and what these democratic institutions are, Chris, you talked about elections. I think Fred, you talked a little bit about some of these like norms, even if it's just around the way we treat veterans. I think we're kind of in some ways finding out what democracy is by when things are threatening a certain thing, right? When we see a new threat to a new norm, we're like, oh, that's a part of this. So maybe to get at, I think what can be a hard question for people, like what do we mean when we say democracy activism is what specific threats are we kind of talking about? Where do you guys see some specific things? So we talked about poll workers, we talked about attacks on veterans. What are other places you've seen, or maybe we saw during the actual Trump administration, where we saw democracy under threat? What did that look like? I know there's strategic litigation, there's all these kind of different moves, but what do some of those threats look like for either one of you? Maybe Fred first. What we talked a little bit yesterday about kind of Schedule F and civil service and some of these things. So when we
Yeah.
talk about threats to our democratic institutions, what have those looked like over the past, say, like 8 years?
For me, what I saw early with the Trump administration, especially, was the willingness what we discovered, I think, early on, was that so much of our government, so much of our the ways of doing business in our democracy, in our government, our republic, constitutional republic, what do you want to call it today, is based on norms and traditions. The idea that people would recognize the loss of an election, that people would recognize that there's a process. Yes, I mean, I think a great example for us who have served, and anybody who's done national security work, is the process for, let's just take the one that's really hot right now, declassifying documents. The idea, in theory, yes, the president is the ultimate arbiter for these kinds of things, but there's a process. Why is there a process? Well, because certain things that are declassified without being checked by their various agencies, be it the 17 intelligence agencies or the FBI, could expose means and methods. They could expose actual people who have been our sources for intelligence information, actual spies, which do exist, or double agents, So if the president just decides to use his power to simply omni declassified, give out a piece of document to the American public, people could die. And so there wasn't actually a regulation, and so Trump's got in his head that he can just declassify. So we discovered with Trump is a man who spent his entire life understanding there's people in the world. And if you've been in business, you know this. There's people in the world whose first question is not, well, what can we do? It's what can I get away with? And Trump's entire business career was based on, here's the law, here's how close I can get to it, or how far I can go beyond it. If you think about, when you drive in the highway, right, the speed limit is 70, but we all know you could probably go 79 and get away with it, right? Trump's entire life has been driving 79 and see me, okay, and never paying a price. So he said, well, nobody ever fucking pulled me over. Pardon my language, guys. I apologize. Nobody ever pulled me over, so I'll go 85. And now he's going 100. And nobody ever. So when he came into government, norms and traditions like the national security process, or issuing an order, then calling the Joint Chiefs, coordinate, having your military call the Joint Chiefs, say, hey, here's the idea. We're really against transgender representation in the military. We think it's gone too far. I'd like to staff this, and we'll issue a policy. No, he literally sent a tweet. Okay. I see that as a threat to our democracy, because that hurt people. We had people deployed overseas who were transgender at that moment, who were serving their country honorably. I know them. I know some, and they're literally in combat at that time. We had missions going on in Iraq, and imagine you're serving on the front line of your country under fire, and you see a effing tweet from the president saying, "Hey, by the way, we want to kick you the F out." It's those kind of norms and traditions. So what we found is the framework of norms and traditions that we'd always relied on. When you had someone as patently rotten, in my opinion, who doesn't care about norms and traditions because he just wants to know what he can get away with, it breaks the whole system. And so I think you see an example of that. Why many of us finally got very involved, I think, in 2020, and Chris made me agree, was we all saw 4 years of this and said to ourselves, Jesus, imagine him as a lame duck. Or imagine a situation where the adults in the room that we did have adults in the room, let's be honest. I'm not a big Mattis fan, but Mattis was there. That first iteration, I had friends, especially at VA. I had so many Republican friends who stood up and said, well, it's a Republican administration. I'm a Republican. I want to serve. And they ended up at the VA. I have two dear friends who were graduated from the Naval Academy at the same time I went for West Point, who ended up serving in the administration at the VA. One ended up paying a heavy price for it, has only just recovered his professional reputation. Another turned out to be MAGA, who knew? But anyway, having said that, those guys left, right? And so who's going to serve in that second Trump administration? All for me, it scared the living hell out of me, because those rules and those norms, traditions, they were willing to do that. And then that's another long answer. But that's what I saw that drove me to say, I got to do more to protect these. Because and partly for those of us who are activists, for me, one of my biggest frustrations, to be candid with our current administration, is when they went back north, they just said, well, we're just gonna set the norm again. And you and I all know that if you have if you had sociology 101, you know that when you break a norm and set a new one, That's now the norm. And that's what Trump did. You have to reset it back. And the way you reset a norm back is laws, regulations, tightening the rules. And unfortunately, our friends in the Biden administration have decided instead just say, well, look, we're just gonna go back to being normal again. Everything's gonna be fine. And the same rules that Trump broke without care, Stephen Miller and those others, are still in place. And so if we have a second Trump administration, they learned. They're ready.
I
And
want to jump in on that Norm's Pete there, Fred. You know, I think about this all the time over the past 15 years, how just beyond Trump, how the norms of our
yeah,
democratic
right.
process
All of it.
totally degraded.
Yep.
2009, South Carolina representative at the State of the Union, you get shouted out, "You lied," and it
Yep.
was the scandal.
This isn't new.
No. And if we look at the State of the Union a couple weeks ago, right? You had representatives on their chairs, hooting and hollering, shouting, engaging with the president in a dialogue back and forth. That degradation of our public discourse has a real impact.
Great example.
And well, we could talk more a little bit about the threats of democracy beyond Trumpism later, but it's huge. So Fred, I know you're
You're
going
right.
to say
I love the
I'm
I love this. Yeah, the speeding example of pushing it. What's the old phrase about, you put a lobster in a pot and you just turn up the temperature a little bit at a time, it doesn't know it, right? And that's what
Right.
some of the times I think it can feel like these norms
Right.
degrading is. It happens little by little, and then before you know it, we're in boiling water.
Right.
Chris, you do a ton of this work. Are we in boiling water? Is this a break-even moment? Do the alarm bells need to be going up for 2024?
I mean, every election is important, right? This election is very important. 2022 is very important. 2026 will continue to be very important. I think what I see, I hear a lot of people talk about, well, I went out and voted. I voted in 2020, nothing happened. Well, listen, the democratic process is a marathon, all right? It is meant to be a slow and steady push towards progress. And so we have to go out there and vote and engage in the process every step of the way. I live in Atlanta, Georgia. I can't tell you how many times I go out and vote. I'm voting constantly because the way that Georgia elections work.
Different elections for the record.
Well,
It's a key qualifier, actually.
Yeah.
And
but I mean, the way that the election process in Georgia works is that and this is how a good example of anti-Democrats who get in, and not like Democrats as a Democratic Party, but people who do not believe in the democratic process get into office and they start twisting the mechanics of government to make it more difficult for democracy to function. So you wear out the populace right now with runoffs and runoffs and all these different things. It's a problem. But to your point about are we under threat? Yeah, absolutely. If we continue on the trajectory that we have for the past 15 years or so, really since the backlash to President Obama's election, this could get bad, and that's why it's so important for veterans to speak up. And I know we're going to talk a little about why veterans later, but I just got to get the plug in right now. The veterans are one of the most credible populations out there, and we have to go out there and act as messengers and constantly talk about the importance of democracy to our friends, our neighbors, our communities. So
and I do want to come back and we're going to talk why veterans. Maybe just to put a punctuation point on this idea of boiling water, because I think we have, maybe a question first to Fred and then I'll come to Chris, but maybe if you could, one thing, just to dial into specifics, what should people be paying attention to? What's one attack happening right now? And then maybe what's one thing that you're worried about if 2025 happens? Like, so where do you see a threat to our democracy in a serious way right now? Or come 2025, what would you be worried about if we do see another Trump administration? What's, maybe a thing that they could do on day one that would attack these norms or processes? Fred, you have a thought or a specific thing for you? What jumps out? What's a specific threat right now that you're paying attention to as a guy who's a politico and who's dialed in and who kind of knows the landscape?
Clearly the failures of our judiciary keeps me up at night. The idea that this third rail that we trusted for so long is clearly not as trustworthy. I mean, let's look at the Kaczynski, whatever. The judge in Texas, who, if you look at the current case, he made a national ban on the abortion pill from his district court in Texas. They're shopping. The right is shopping their court cases on abortion to his district on purpose, knowing he will take this length to make it a national. So he banned a national drug against the FDA from his little district court, which had to go all the way to the Supreme Court. Luckily, what we think we heard, but then this is the Supreme Court today. We think that they were like, even I want to say Alito, even Alito was like, yeah, I'm not really cut the idea of a district judge thinking he can outlaw stuff now. You can tell even the far right judges were troubled by the fact that one of their own is doing their job, basically, right? So there's real danger in our judiciary that really does keep me up at night, right? And again, that's the thing. Now, the second part of the question you asked is like, what do I worry about in 20? Look, they told us, okay, if you've never heard of Project 2025, which is possible, there's actually two. There's Project 2025 and Agenda 47. Project 2025 is over 80 groups shepherded by the Heritage Foundation, which normally issues a policy platform for each Republican administration. But this time went a bit further with the funding dark money to the tune of $22 million, has funded an entire plan to essentially remake our government in a conservative way. And I'm not getting called conservative anymore, MAGA way. And one of the most really dark things about that is this idea of Schedule F, which Trump tried to administer in the end of his administration, but failed. The idea of making thousands and thousands of civil servants at-will employees so they can be fired. They're not towing the party line. And the idea they're recruiting supposedly now, I don't know how successful they are, but they're supposed to recruiting 30 to 50,000 people who will be ready on day one. They'll Schedule F will be on day one. Also, they've talked about implementing the Insurrection Act on day one. They've talked about using National Guard from red states to go into blue states and conduct deportation raids. There's just so many scary shit in there, and it's written this beautifully bureaucratic language that you'll read and you'll get done and go, what did I just read? And it's some really scary stuff. And they've also admitted that the scary stuff they didn't actually put in there because the left is watching. And that's before we get to Agenda 47, which is the Stephen Miller plan, which is the actual official plan for the Trump administration, which does include Insurrection Act. It does include activating sheriffs, constitutional sheriffs, and deputizing them to deport people with federal powers. There's some really, really scary stuff that turns our democracy into a banana republic. And for me, and I talk about a lot in my show, it probably makes my followers sick of it, but sitting in a shack in Iraq in 2004, a mud brick house outside of Q West base, asking my sheikh, we started having bombs go off on the highway. And I asked Sheikh Mohammed, Dr. Mohammed, I said, Dr. Mohammed, I don't understand it. I don't understand how Iraqis are driving by this it's Highway 1. I mean, you guys know it's the highway from Baghdad to Mosul. It's the busiest road. It's I-95. And I'm like, and we were 3 kilometers from it. I said, I understand how people are driving by. They're seeing these guys put the bombs in and no one's reporting it. No one's seeing it. And he said to me, he says, Major Wellman, you must understand the way you survive in Iraq under Saddam and for 35 years with dictatorship is you learn not to see things. You don't see when the black vehicles roll up to your neighbor's house and scoop everybody up. You don't see when the village next door gets raided because they're against Saddam. You survive by not seeing because of the fear. And I project that to you don't see when your Mexican neighbors who are illegal get raided by the sheriff because they're brown. Okay. And I remember saying to Dr. Muhammad, I said, well, thank God I live in America. I never want to see that. And here I am in 2024. And it's not a fantasy to make the leap that we'll have people raiding. I mean, a story I tell often, I'm sure people are sick of it, is imagine you own a painting company in Smithville, fucking Missouri, and your number one competitor, you look like me, your number one competitor is Juan Gonzalez painting. You just call up that constitutional sheriff or the National Guard from Texas that's in our state and say, hey, man, I think Juan Gonzalez is employing illegals. I'm pretty sure I saw some illegals there. They kick in the door, raid the place, turn all the files upside down, take the computers, haul everybody in. There's not one illegal, but you just took out your number one competitor.
Yeah.
That's scary.
Just a personal story. It's weird. For people who don't know, I'm a lawyer by trade. I have a law degree.
Yes,
That's what I did after
we
undergrad.
still like you though. I mean, we still
Thanks.
like you.
Yeah. And no, I used to tell people that my wartime experience, I saw a place without rule of law, and it really, for me, wanted me to be a part of it. Now, when I started out, I was just doing an insurance defense litigation, but just to be a part of a rule of law system meant a lot. And at the time when I kind of started all that, I had no idea that it was going to be so prescient. But I think that's that willful blindness that you talked about talking to Dr. Muhammad and being in Iraq, I think is so, and I think a lot of veterans probably have similar experiences of going to other
Oh
places
yeah.
and kind of seeing um to switch to Chris for real quick because I want to get through it and there's so much I still want to talk about. But
I talk too much.
I
I
think that's a
apologize.
scary. Yeah, no, we love it, Fred.
You're a
And
media
thanks again.
personality. I like, I mean, that's
Yeah.
what you do, right? Yeah.
Chris, I know you spend a lot of time thinking about 2025. What are you on the lookout for?
Yeah. Well, I think what Fred talked about Project 2025. What I am really concerned about is the misuse of the military. What we saw in the Trump administration 1.0 was the militarization of active duty troops sent to the border to engage in border work. I don't really know what they were doing, but this idea was normalized that, hey, the active duty is now part of the immigration apparatus. That is not what should be happening at all. And in 2020, we saw the military suppress free speech. So the idea of some sort of National Guard domestic deployment or insurrection act where the military can come in and actually abuse the free speech of citizens is really scary to me. Now, that's not our community. We really have to start telling our active duty counterparts that, hey, you need to know what an illegal order is, because no one in that Black Hawk that buzzed the protesters in DC, that crew chief should have known that was an illegal order, and they should never have gone and done that. And the active duty community had better be really ready to push back because they're really our last line of defense against the misuse of power. The other thing outside of the military, just from the democratic process that I'm concerned about outside of Trump and Trumpism, is gerrymandering, is the partisanship of our elections, how you can have a state like Florida, for example, that has just blatantly blown through the law. Like they pushed through gerrymandered districts that they knew were illegal, that have been and will continue to be overturned by the Supreme Court. Alabama also had this issue. You have this anti-democratic trend, excuse me, from democratically elected lawmakers who believe that if they can just get into power, then they can just dismantle the institution of democracy. And that's outside of the misuse of the military. I would say that's my biggest concern.
Yeah.
Good answer.
And I think that's a really good spot. There's a question in the chat that actually I'm going to take early, and partly because it's from an incredibly smart guy who's done a lot of great Afghan work for us. So I'll just call him Jeff. Jeff out there. Thank you for your question, and it's perfect. You talked about the active duty community needing to be ready. I think we know it's hard. It's harder for active duty to take action, right? Like there's Hatch Act, there's all kinds of norms around active duty. Who there is the community that can speak, it's us here now. Like I know a lot of people joining are veterans and we're veterans. I think veterans, myself, play an important part in democracy activism. I'm a part of VFAI, obviously I believe that, but I think it's worth asking the question of why veterans and how do we participate? It's a long question, but I'd like to kind of hit the highlights. And Fred, maybe we can start with you. But Jeff asks, in an era where the fabric of our democracy appears increasingly strained by polarization, misinformation, and a general erosion of public trust in institutions, veterans kind of represent, they're an institution that still has a lot of public trust. Veterans uniquely embody the principles of service, sacrifice, and commitment to the common good. With all of our diverse experiences in serving and safeguarding our nation, I'd like to think that most veterans hold a profound understanding of the stakes involved in preserving a democratic society. As we approach another election cycle, how can veterans leverage their leadership skills, their understanding of teamwork and mission, and the moral authority that we have to fortify the pillars of democracy? So the question in short, and for Fred, for you, it's the same question we've talked about, kind of why veterans, but yeah, how do veterans leverage this cultural cache that we have, this public trust, and our knowledge from these wartime experiences, like we've talked about, to fortify democracy, to make it harder for these kind of parade of horribles that we've talked about to kind of happen? You know, Fred, why do veterans have a unique spot? You have a podcast. You know, how important is it to you that you are doing not just a democracy podcast, but a veteran democracy podcast. You know, why veterans? Why does it matter for this conversation that we're having?
I want to set the tone clearly though before I answer that. I
Yeah.
want us to make sure we're not being naive about our community. I think too often we take the first step
Yes.
is, and I have to be honest about this, I am not popular in the veterans community anymore. Okay. I'm not welcomed at veterans events. I had to piece out of my entire West Point alumni class chat groups and Facebook pages because of the Gen X hate that I get from my own peers in the military. So keep in mind, one of the biggest MAGA assholes right now is Eli Crane, who was a Navy SEAL and rode that Navy SEAL fame, to his stupid bottle opener company and then his effing, election to Congress. Tom Cotton is as Ranger qualified as I am. I have a tab, so does he. So we have to be honest about who we are, that there is a divide within our own community, which is what led me to where I am now. Having said that, I've worked with a lot of wonderful organizations like Veterans for Responsible Leadership, my friend Dan Barkoff's organization. VFRL was one of my big partners at Lincoln Project when I was there. I organized, it's funny, when I joined Lincoln Project, Steve Smith was like, I want my own council of generals. We got, I'm like, no, fuck that. Nobody's listening to generals. All respect to Mark Hertling. Actually, not much, but either way, everybody's got their, sorry, I shouldn't have said that out loud. Sorry. I hope Mark, hope you're not here, but
We'll forgive you. Let it fly.
Yeah, anyway, he fucking hates me. Everybody's got their council of generals. I said, no, we need veterans and military families. We need the actual people who are living in the communities and not, lording above us for a decade at a time. I know. So I formed just Blue Star moms, Gold Star wives, National Guard service members, because those are the people in the communities and can have these conversations. So I agree wholeheartedly with Jeff in the sense we do have we still have a respected portion of our community, and especially I think those of us who are more on the liberal side are really respected on the left for a certain voice. But organizing together has been the key for me. Like I said, finding groups like VFRL, VFAI, Vet the Vote, those organizations, it's coming together and finding those places to be. And then also, look, this is the thing I say, and veterans are no different than others. There's a real place for us to participate in our local. So that's my third caveat, and I'll give it to Chris, is we don't need to be separate, right? I think the answer for us is we're in it. And so for me, knocking doors in North Georgia in August, which did put all my Ranger skills together because it was hotter than balls. Knocking doors in North Georgia and talking to somebody, it was nothing more fun than walk up a house of a door that I'd been assigned by the campaign I was working on. It was Marcus Flowers. There was a Marine. I remember specifically there was a black man with a Marine Corps stickers all over his car. How do you know he's a Marine? Because their car's covered in globe and anchor.
We'll tell you. Marines will tell you as a Marine.
Makes it super
yeah,
easy.
We'll let you know.
I'm the son of a Marine. Hey, Semper Fi. And my dad was in World War II. When you serve, sir? We can have these conversations with our peers and civilians. Wear an Army shirt. Whatever, so that we do have respect. And people are surprised often when a liberal vet shows up at their door. So I don't necessarily say that we do have a unique voice and experience, like the experience that so many of us had in Iraq or Afghanistan, where we saw the machinations of failed democracy. We can bring that to our fellow Americans. So I do believe there's a place for us. And I can tell you, man, the skills you mentioned, Jeff, with organizing, leadership, management, oh my God, there's not a campaign on earth from president to effing school board that couldn't use those skills. And organizing a field team, motivating young kids, motivating soccer moms, motivating stay-at-home moms to get out and knock doors or to wave a sign. So I do believe that there's a place for us and our unique skills and our ability to stand in the heat for not 5 hours and think it's awesome to get out and be a part of these and lead. But that's me. Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, absolutely. Chris, and maybe I could tee this up a little bit. I think Fred brought up a really interesting point. I think in veteran activism, this getting a general letter together used to be kind of a thing, right? And it used to make headlines.
Yeah.
So before we go to the second question, but first, you work in veteran organizing and you do both grassroots and kind of high level stuff. We've done general letters, right? We put together how many flag officers. Is that era going away? Do those letters and how many 4-stars have impact? And is it more about the grassroots organizing, or is it a balance of those two things? And then also, same question. Why do veterans matter?
Yeah, I think the letter thing is really. I was actually in a call yesterday, and this person we're talking about domestic deployment in the military, and they were like, we just need to get a bunch of 3-star generals. And I don't think they understood there was actually 4-star generals. Like they thought that 3-star was the highest. So like to them, it was just like they are, and I had to tell them, like, I don't have generals in my pocket, right? Like, that's not how this works.
I don't take my call anymore anyway.
But I mean, that type of organizing is effective for specific issues. And I think about the Afghan Adjustment Act, for example, which we're still trying to get through Congress. But a lot of movement was made last summer when we did a couple general sign-ons, and that was able to move certain members of the Senate. You know, the average person who is trying to figure out, like, you know, what they wanted, how they can improve their community, they don't care how many generals that you have. They what they care about is the veteran that they know is saying a thing, right? That's why the veteran cache is so important. I'm gonna give you a really good example of this. A guy I went to Iraq with, he and I were sergeants together, lowly E5s. He went off to he stayed in. He's still actually now a first sergeant, but he's a teacher. And last election cycle, he became poll worker. I think it was his first time being a poll worker. And he's in the National Guard still. And he, you know, a couple weeks after the election, one of his students was a high school teacher. One of his students was kind of diving into some election denialism territory, right? I don't know, this doesn't make sense. Trump this, Trump, you know, Trump won actually. And my friend who said, hold on a second, I'm a veteran. I'm still active. Like, I'm still in the National Guard. I was a poll worker. Are you saying that I rigged the election? And, you know, then that class of high schoolers, of seniors, was able to have a really frank discussion about, like, disinformation, the threats to democracy of that. And that, I think, is the real importance for the work that we do here at VFAI, that I've seen a few different other veteran groups on this call today. We need to be organizing our community to be validators and messengers in their communities, because nobody in Richmond, Virginia, is going to care what letter General Petraeus signed on to, but they are going to care about Mr. Ziegenfuss, who was a poll worker in his precinct.
Sorry, I am just dropping if you want to sign up to be a poll worker, at the vote, there's a thing there. It's a great organization, and the poll worker thing is really neat. No, I think that's that leads really nicely to our next question. And maybe Chris, you can start with us, and then we can go back to Fred since you're already going. So we, you know, veterans have this cache that you were kind of talked about, and it seems to make a difference. What are, other than, you know, vet the vote and signing up to be poll workers, what are some other ways that veterans or civilians who are veteran affiliated can start to get involved? What does that look like? What are some good steps for folks that they can take?
Yeah, so I would just say we at VFAI over the next, you know, few months, we're going to be organizing a convening at the national level as soon as we're able to kind of get that organized to actually go to Congress and talk about pro-democracy initiatives that we're pushing. So would love to have folks sign up once we get that off the ground. But I think the thing that, just beyond institutional plugs, right? Like veterans need to, when they see something, say something. When they see a grift against democracy, they need to say it. And I hate to say it, but, like, the veteran community is not immune from their own grifts, right? And I think we need to call out people who are running for office, people who are in elected office, who's using their veteranness, cashing in on that to dismantle the democratic process, to undermine an election, to, you know, do whatever. Because so oftentimes when an elected official is, if they're a veteran and they're called out on this, you know, they could fall behind that flag. They could say, I served our country and I believe this and I believe that. And it takes a veteran to be able to turn that around and say, I see that. That's bullshit. All right. And, you know, you might be an elected official. We might have worn the same uniform, but right now we're not sharing the same values, and people need to see that. So that's what I would say to that.
Yeah. Fred, do you think that's true? I've noticed that myself. It feels like sometimes when veterans are saying veteran things that I might disagree with, that civilians might be, I actually wrote about this. It's kind of a big deal for me, is, you know, it becomes hard to combat some of those narratives when there's maybe bad actors or actors I just disagree with on the other side who are saying certain things and kind of claiming that mantle of veteranness that I might not agree with. And it seems like there's a lot of times kind of a cultural battle point, right? Or front lines on what it means and what veteran identity means and who gets to control that. that narrative and that definition. Does that feel true for yourself? Do you find yourself kind of engaged in struggles over what that veteran identity means?
Yes. And I try not to be one of those because I get it. Look, anytime I say anything, some asshole's going to go through my entire, oh, you're a PAO. You never saw any acts. Like, okay, if you think that, that's cool. I was at 22 years. You know, only 2 of my tours of combat were actually, but sure. Okay, we'll go with that. Oh, you're not a real ranger. Like, okay, that's cool. I was in 100 days of ranger school, but you're right. I'm not a ranger. You know, and my funniest one was when I was still running my PR firm when that guy killed those civilians in Afghanistan. Remember that horrible murder of 16 civilians? And tried to blame PTSD. I of course, being who I am and a person who does have PTSD, called that out. And some guy got obsessed with the fact that I wasn't a real ranger because I hadn't actually served in the regiment. And so he was literally going like all the Facebook groups on him, like on Facebook of the infantry guys saying, this guy's a stolen valor. I'm like, okay. You know, here's my graduation photo. But civilians do look to us to police our community. And I do think there is important. I mean, you could argue, I try never to say, but when you have someone like a J.R. Majewski who uses his veteran status in such an egregious way and adds to his and pads his resume so egregiously to say he was in combat in Afghanistan, kicking down doors, and he was literally a passenger manifest guy in Qatar. And maybe he set foot in Afghanistan. I don't think so. But either way is you know, and so when you've got someone who's people listen to us to say, oh, I'm reading your duty 214, bro, and this doesn't equal this, doesn't, you know, all those medals. It might, you know, you guys, you see every story. He was highly decorated. Yeah, and you look it up, he's got like an achievement medal. Like, nah, it's not a thing. He's not highly decorated with 3 achievement medals. Like, yeah, but he's got 3 of them. Like, oh, well, 3 achievement medals. And so they do look to us to police our community and ensure that we're being honest with each other. And we have to, there's a limit to it. We don't want to just go after everybody and stuff. And the whole thing, I'd be very honest with you guys. I've never gone after Tom Cotton about the Ranger thing. There, look, whatever. If you're in a range, you can actually be inducted in the Ranger Hall of Fame, having done nothing but gone to Ranger school. Okay. So, you know, it's just that kind of jumping over, you know, the mouse hills and mole hills that does annoy our community, that our community does way too much of that on both sides. But by the same token, you're right. If you've got an organization, there's a group that's a right-wing group that is funded by dark money from the Koch brothers that called themselves a veteran service organization. I was running a VSO panel, a council in Fredericksburg, Virginia, and Concerned Veterans of America showed up, their rep, and tried to sell them to our members as being a veteran service organization. That would a veteran, the term VSO has very specific meaning. Okay. It means they've been certified by Congress. They are able to help veterans get their claims. And they're a PAC, they're C4 or C9, whatever they are. You know, they're not a veteran service. And so when I called them out, I caught a lot of hell for it, but those groups are not who they say they are. And I think we have to be very smart about how we work within our community. I hope there's a time where we can work with our fellow and have these conversations. But like I said, we have to be honest about our community. Our community's got some people who are really all believers in the MAGA movement. There's believers in uniform right now, guys. Okay, those guys deploying National Guard on the border, doing something. If you look very carefully at the story about the people who drowned in the river that night, it was our fellow service members staying at that gate denying access. So we have to be very honest with ourselves about our own community, and there are bad actors within our community, and that if you want to know what keeps me up at night, that's what keeps me up at night.
No, 100%. It's frustrating, like I said, and that's probably why I think so. You know, VFAI and podcasts like yours are so important because, yeah, you know, there's a kind of a battle for the heart and the soul of what it means to be a veteran. And I think it's why it's important we stay in the arena. There's a great question from another great St. Louisan, from Amir Hosdick,
my man.
Midwest is really getting some rep here.
Friendly, yeah, man. St. Louis representing this shit right here, bro.
St. Louis is doing great. And I think it's such a great question. It's a tactical question, but it's the kind that I think we should,
great question.
That we need to think about. So for Chris and Fred, whoever would like to take it, is there any room for bipartisanship within the veteran community groups? I think that's something that we all struggle with, right? Like we want to be nonpartisan. We want to be bipartisan. The issues that veterans face are so often nonpartisan issues. They go to the kind of the core of what it means to be America, but it's harder and harder to not pick a side. And then sometimes in some of the advocacy work I do, you know, I'll be honest, it's easier to be partisan, and it feels like that's the move. But when it comes to democracy work, what do you guys think? Do you have to pick a side? Is that necessary?
I'll kick it up. I mean, just again to reiterate, we are a 501(c)(3 nonpartisan organization. So, this is not us endorsing one party or the other. And even within the Republican Party, there is this major split that we're seeing on display all the time. Paul Ryan came out with he did an interview, I think yesterday or the day before, really talking about this split. So what I would say is we need a functioning minimum two-party system in the United States in order to have a republic that works. Ideally, we'd like to have more, and I'd love to see other initiatives that would maybe open up and kind of break this duopoly that we have in the process. In lieu of a two-functioning system, two-party functioning system, we need to figure out how we're going to operate, right, and how we're going to move forward, and that means supporting initiatives and people to run for office to really fix the democratic process. So that's maybe not a non-answer. I think ideally if we're talking about tax policy and healthcare reform and immigration laws and things like that. That is one thing, but when you have a significant part of one party that is actively trying to subvert the democratic process, that's totally different, and that's going to be really, really hard, for us to say that is actually bipartisan. Because I would say if we're going to be nodding to that type of Republican Party, we're actually nodding to the destruction of our democratic republic. So. Fred?
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah, Fred,
I
you're
would
a
love.
consultant, so yeah, you're coming from a little bit
Hyper
different
partisan.
angle.
So Chris is nice enough because I'm like so hyper partisan. I'm not even welcome in our own party. And I'm friends with Amir, and I think Amir and I are on different sides of the political spectrum sometimes. I'm almost sure of it. I think he's hanging on the other side, and I really and we have great drinks together. I dream of the day where we just get to hang out and talk about war stories and baseball and Cardinals, and I try to do that in my own life. I have family members who don't agree. I just spent 3 days in Jacksonville, Florida with my family members for a funeral, unfortunately, and not one of them agrees with me on anything. I'm sure of that. I didn't talk about work. But I do believe there's a play. I mean, I dream the days we don't worry about these. We hang out at baseball games again. Unfortunately, it's not as easy. And by the same token, and Amir will appreciate it, I've gotten chased out of a bar and I had to leave a bar in what was it, Ellisville, a little sports bar there in the corner of Manchester and Clarkson because the gentleman next to me discovered that I was a podcaster on the left and wanted to give me his opinion of Hunter Biden, among other things. And luckily the bartender gave me my bill and I left. So it is tough. It's a tough time to find things we agree on. It's a tough time. It's funny how, and I'll leave it at this. Everybody keeps showing these polls where Americans are worried about democracy. 98% of Americans are better. But if we call going to the in political speak, going to the tabs. When you go to the tabs, which is the differences between the two people on the sides of the partisan divide, our side, the left, my side, the left says I'm really worried about these institutions and people attacking our capital. I'm worried about people, that being denied the right to vote. But you look at the tab on the other side, I'm worried about them stealing the election again, and I'm worried about them, shipping in illegal immigrants and letting them vote. So we can't even agree on what a threat to democracy is.
Yeah.
So I would love to be Mr. Happy, and I'm just guess I'm not. I do believe we're gonna have to keep fighting on our side of it to assure that our constitutional republic, I always get that one, survives this very difficult time, because we really are in a position where there are forces at work that would like to see your vote taken away from you. They would like to see rules like only 2 terms for a president thrown out, and I don't. I can't wait to just hang around and tell war stories again. But I just, it's not today, unfortunately.
Yeah, no, I'm right there with you. We're coming up on the end of our time. I want to give both you guys a chance to talk a little bit. So, Chris, 90 seconds. We just talked about democracy for an hour. In 90 seconds, coming out of this, what's at the top of your mind? What are the topics that you either want to leave people with, or that questions that have been raised for you by this conversation?
I mean, what I want to leave people with is your voice matters. Your voices as veterans is incredibly important. I've said multiple times, the veteran community is one of the most respected, but we are also, it's not just generic veteran is most respected, right? The peer-to-peer, veteran to veteran, veteran to non-veteran relationship is one of the most unbreakable relationships. Use that, leverage that. We're going to have opportunities for folks to get out and speak out on this, on the democratic process coming up. But really the fight starts with your first and second, circles of social circles in your community. Go out there, talk to them, engage with folks, because I almost quoted the Washington Post, democracy dies in darkness, right? But like the idea that if we don't actually confront the ideologies that are trying to threaten our democratic process, the idea that they're just going to go away, that's a fairy tale. So go out there and act as validators for democracy.
I love that. Fred, same question to you, 90 seconds. What do you want people to know coming away from this?
It's up to you. I mean, democracy is a participation sport. It is as simple as picking up the phone and dialing. It's as simple as going to find your local campaign and say, "Hey, I got time. What can I do on my time?" It's as simple as maybe you don't have one in your area. You can postcard. You can actually dial. You can remote dial. Believe it or not, you can go to the DNC website and sign up to. They'll sign you up to do remote calls for candidates. I mean, there are so many ways in the modern era for us to participate in this democracy in any way you can, as a veteran, as a citizen, as a friend, and no matter where you fall on the partisan divide, that it's on you if you choose not to participate. So, none of us who served in this era were all volunteers. We did volunteer, and we stepped up. And I'm just telling you right now, our country does need you. That I'm telling you, man, a little bitty state Senate race or a congressional race in Southern Illinois with no money, a person like any of the people I've seen, the names I've seen and recognized on this chat would be like a godsend to that candidate who has no money and just needs somebody who's smart to step in and say, "What can I take off your plate?" So please just get in the fight. Don't. It's not tweeting. Look, I'm a tweet guy, right? Like it's not tweet. It's not even my fucking podcast. Let's be honest. I just talk. I also I help every Missouri candidate that needs help. I help them. We got a record number of Democratic candidates this cycle. I give them free consulting services. I'm on the kitchen cabinet for a state Senate race. Whatever you can do, it's more than just talk.
Yeah, I love that so much. There's a comment in the chat from Paul who says democracy is a verb, and I love that. And just to tell you guys too, to maybe cap this a little bit, in August of 21, when Afghanistan was falling, I got together with Fred. It's about more than tweeting. We did fundraisers and things, but because we're in the same community, and I'm sure Amir was a part of this too, but I gave Fred a call.
He was.
And I was like, "Hey man, our local RA needs bodies." And Fred got on the horn with an Air Force base that was nearby, and he got 50 people there to help sort donations. Democracy is a verb. That's what it looks like. It's not just about tweeting and talking about veterans. Fred's an organizational wizard, but it was just such a cool thing. And that's what it takes sometimes, is doing good stuff in the community. That was an immigration issue. That was about Afghanistan, but I think our democracy is the same things. How do we get those guys with buses there, unloading the boxes, doing the work? And that's what this election looks like. Thank you so much to Chris, VFAI director, for being here. Fred, make sure to subscribe to his podcast On Democracy with FP Wellman. Anywhere you get your podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts. It's great stuff. Make sure you stay in tune to VFAI. We're going to have more conversations like these going ahead into the election, plus a lot more content and stuff to arm you guys as the veterans out there for what you need to do and how you can take steps to defend American democracy. Thank you so much for joining us. Thanks again to our guests. Thanks to Emily and the VFAI staff. You guys are great. There's going to be an email coming out tomorrow that'll follow this up, and this was recorded, so you can share this with anybody who couldn't join us. We know it's the middle of the day, but that email should contain that link, so you can share this with your friends and hopefully join us next time. Thank you guys so much for taking an hour out of your lunch to talk about democracy and veterans. We appreciate you guys. Take care. Have a good one. And democracy is a verb, so go out there and do something today. Thanks, guys.
Get to work.
Thanks all.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.